Hi, it's Drake, and today I have a video about two different books that I read in the last few days. And they had some surprising overlaps that I wasn't really expecting when I decided to read both. And I didn't connect them at all in my mind before I started to read them, but it turns out they have some interesting similarities, which I'll talk about. Um, The first one I read was The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, which is by Nabokov. And it was his first novel written in English, but it was his ninth novel actually written. Of course, he wrote in Russian first. But there's a misconception that he learned English later in life, kind of like Joseph Conrad or something like that. But he actually had an English governess or like a tutor, and I think there's an anecdote that he learned how to read in English before he learned how to read in Russian. So it's not really fair to say that like English was his second language and he just miraculously wrote really well in it. It was more like he was concurrently fluent in Russian and English from an early age as far as writing and reading. So but yeah, The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, it was apparently written pretty quickly. And you can kind of get that feeling from the book. I mean, it is just a very, if you read anything of any quality, it is fairly quick, smooth read. Not really many snags anywhere. But it is pretty neat because, especially if you read later stuff and read widely, you can see connections between it and a lot of later writers especially, but also, of course, writers before. So if you're not familiar, the book itself, well, actually, I'll say the second book I'm going to be talking about. The second book I'm going to be talking about is A Heart So White by Javier Marías. So I'll draw out the connections after I talk about each book. So going back to The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, so it is basically the narrator is making a book about his older brother named Sebastian Knight, who was a writer. And the main reason he's writing a book is because there was already a book written about his brother that he thinks is horrible and wrong, misinterprets everything, because his older brother was a writer, and this critic who wrote the biography of Sebastian Knight apparently misread a lot of stuff that you can find in his writing. So it's kind of a satire on criticism that, they think they can learn everything from someone's novels, as if, people don't have an imagination. But of course you can learn quite a lot about a writer by their novels, but there's a limit, and can be difficult sometimes. But that's just the start of the book. It starts to turn into somewhat of a mystery, kind of a mystery novel, which is another connection it has with A Heart So White. But it's an unconventional mystery because he's trying to discover his older brother's life, and he gets caught on these paths of trying to find his old friends and women he was interested in, and inspiration for certain passages in his writing, things that he can remember of his older brother whenever they were children, and maybe connections that it has in his writing. So that's kind of interesting in the way that it's a kind of a literary detective thing. It brings to mind Borges, it brings to mind Roberto Bolaño with 2666 and Savage Detectives. So that was kind of a nice connection, and I just kind of like those sort of things. And then near the end, it is pretty interesting, and I'll touch on that whenever I talk about the Marías. So the other book that I'm going to be talking about here is A Heart So White by Javier Marías. And I read that one second, and I had no idea it would have any similarities or any connections at all with Nabokov. But when I started to read it, I was starting to get Nabokov vibes, actually, with the cosmopolitan characters, because Sebastian Knight and his brother, the narrator of the book, they speak multiple languages. They go around countries in Europe, staying in hotels, have friends all over the place, born in Russia, go to school in England, live in France, that sort of thing. And with Marías, you kind of get the same feeling. The main character, Juan, is a translator for the UN. And so he speaks multiple languages, translates, travels to New York, travels to Brussels, travels to Switzerland, and translates for politicians and business people and all this. So you kind of get the same feeling. For A Heart So White, Juan, his father, is kind of wealthy guy, is an expert on art. It's really witty and excellent at parties, that sort of thing. And interestingly enough, Juan, the main character of A Heart So White, actually reads a Nabokov novel in the book. He reads Penin, which is one of the other Nabokov books I've read. I've also read Penin and Pale Fire, which I'll make a connection to those two when I talk about the connection between the two books. But Heart So White also, it turns out, is effectively somewhat of a mystery or detective story, but it's of course not like a Sherlock Holmes type of thing. It mainly follows Juan and his different digressions of memory, trying to figure out about his father's past marriages, because Juan is the child of his father's third marriage. We start off in the book with only knowing of one previous marriage, which was to Juan's mother's sister, so Juan's aunt. And somehow Juan, the only thing Juan knows is that somehow she died. And as the book progresses, you start to learn more and more. And I will say at this point, if you're interested in reading the books, if you haven't read them yet, or if spoilers worry you, I would recommend probably not watching the rest, just as a heads up. So the one main connection I wanted to make between them is how they give personality to their characters. So I have a passage picked out from A Heart So White. It's a little bit longer, but I just thought it was so excellent. It reminded me a lot of the Diary of Emilio Renzi that I read on my channel. But it's like a 3-minute video where the character falls in love when he's a young boy, and he gets in fights, and his family thinks he's crazy because he's fighting, because people would pick on the girl and throw like thorns in her hair. And then she moved away, and he always imagined, he was the first girl that he loved, and that sort of idea. But this kind of ties into that a little bit. So this is the main character, Juan, talking about his childhood village that he lived in. And he would go to this stationery shop where there was a girl there that he liked. The owner's daughter, a girl almost my own age, slightly younger, began working there when she was 13 or 14 years old. It was a modest, old-fashioned establishment, one of those places that progress forgets and leaves on one side in order to highlight its totalitarian achievements. And for many years it remained almost entirely unrenovated. Although latterly some work has been done on it, it's improved since the father died. They've modernized it somewhat and will doubtless make more money as a consequence. But then, when I was 14 or 15, they probably made very little, and that was why, at least in those days, the girl worked there in the afternoons. She was very pretty. I really liked her, and I used to go to the stationer's almost every day just to see her. Instead of buying what I wanted all in one go, I'd buy a pencil one day and a notebook the next, an eraser one afternoon, and the following day an inkwell. I invented needs I didn't have. I spent a lot of pocket money in that stationer's. And I would linger before leaving the shop and whistle while I waited to be attended to, the way boys of my age did at the time. I'd do my best to make sure that she was the one who served me. I'd watch to see when she was free before opening my mouth, rather than her father or her mother. I'd take much longer than was necessary, and I'd feel happy for the rest of the afternoon if I got a smile from her or look that was friendly or at least interpretable. But above all, I'd leave contentedly thinking about the abstract future. There was time enough for everything. She was in the shop afternoon after afternoon, always in the same place, and there was no reason why the future should ever become concrete, should ever stop being future. I didn't stay the age I was then, nor did the girl, who grew and continued to be lovely for several years. She was there in the mornings, too, by then. From the time she was 16 years old or so, she was there all day. She served in the shop all the time while I was in university. She no longer studied. I didn't talk to her when we were both at school, and I didn't talk to her later either. At first because I didn't dare to, and later because the time for it had passed. That's the worst thing about the abstract future when it remains just that. Although I used to look at her, my mind was on other things, concerned with the variable present, and I used to visit the stationers less often. I never said a word to her other than to thank her for paper and pencils, files and erasers, and to say thank you. To ask her for paper and pencils, files and erasers, and to say thank you. So I have no idea what she's like, what kind of person she is, or what she likes doing, if she's pleasant to talk to, if she's good-tempered or moody, her opinions on any particular topic, if she laughs, how she kisses. All I know is that when I was 15 years old, I loved her the way one does love then, or the way one loves things that haven't yet begun, that is, believing that it will last forever. But I'd go further and say that her way of looking and smiling the way she had then deserved to be loved forever, and that was nothing to do with my being 15 years old, but with what I'm saying now. Her name was and is Nieves. Another 15 years or more have passed since I lived in Ron's house. Ron's is his father. But sometimes when I go there, or when I've been to visit him or to pick him up after going to lunch together at La Trainera, or to some other restaurant further off, I've gone into the stationer's before going up to his apartment out of a habit, which I still haven't entirely lost, of always buying something there, and every time during all these years I found that girl who is now no longer a girl. I've seen her at 23, at 26, at 29, and at 33 or 34, which is the age she must be now. I saw her one day shortly before getting married to Luisa. She's still a young woman. She must be, because I've always known her age, more or less, and she was only a little younger than me. She must be, but she doesn't look it. She's no longer lovely, and I don't understand why, since she's still at an age when she could be. She's probably spent too many years stuck in that stationer's morning and afternoon, although not night or on Sundays or Saturdays after midday, but that's of no account. Serving her goods to children who don't know her as their equal or their beloved, but for some time now as a grown-up. So I just thought that was a really nice description of kind of that like early type of like foolish love that's always in the abstract future. And it really shows Marías' ability of characterization, because you learn a lot there about the narrator, how he views things, very observant, kind of quiet. And then you also learn about the stationer's daughter. And then to show a similar way, I can't look at it word for word because I read The Real Life of Sebastian Knight on my phone, which I'm recording with now. But there was a part where the narrator of that one, Sebastian's younger brother, talks about when he was younger, Sebastian would always write in a particular journal that he would lock away in this lock box that he had on his wall. And one day he found the key. The narrator found the key to his older brother's lockbox, opened it, found the journal in there. He also found a photograph of one of his classmates' sisters. He found a few gold coins and then a bag of violet sweets, all locked up away. And this is in the part where you're still pretty early on in the book, and just those few objects can tell you so much. Of course, Sebastian is fictional, but it tells you so much about a person. So that was the first thing I wanted to highlight, really. But then the other thing, and I'll try to go kind of quickly on this. I wanted this to be somewhat of a shorter video, but this is where you get to spoilers. So at the end of the real life of Sebastian Knight, and you can kind of tell where the book is going just by the title, because it's tongue-in-cheek, the real life of Sebastian Knight. Well, who knows the real life of Sebastian Knight? The critic obviously doesn't know the real life. And then the brother, of course, comes to realize, or knows from the start, honestly, that he can never know the real life of Sebastian Knight. Neither can the readers know the real life of Sebastian Knight. And then there's a trick or an insinuation at the end of the novel that maybe this is Sebastian Knight writing his own narration. Because Nabokov is pretty playful, and if you've read him, you know this. But at the very end, the narrator is trying to find his brother because he's gotten this telegram that his brother is dying and he has to go immediately as quick as he can to see him. And he goes to this hospital, a long circuitous route, goes to this hospital and tries to find his brother. But the nurse doesn't really understand what he's saying, so tells him, oh, go here, there, that's where he is. With a K, right? And then he says, yeah, okay, oh, that's him, yeah. So he goes in and listens to this person breathing and tries not to disturb them. It's dark, it's nighttime. And he comes to find out that that was the wrong person. His brother had actually died the night before. But before he knew his brother died, he was convincing himself that he was having a really close experience with his brother on his dying bed. And he was having this really deep connection because they hadn't really been close for a long time. But of course, that wasn't his brother. The connection he was having was fictional. And he says at the very end, it's this really, kind of, trickster type of writing that the narrator says that I might be Sebastian Knight. And then similarly, at the end of A Heart So White, when Juan finds out about his father's past, and you start to notice as a reader these themes that have continued through, or what would you say? These rhymes of action have continued through the novel, where you see this kind of one-off event that you're kind of like, okay, I guess that's somewhat interesting, but it's not really significant yet. But you kind of know that at some point it'll come all together. And of course, Marías weaves all of his threads really well. And it comes together at the end perfectly, I think. And all of his digressions that at first seem, well, I enjoyed them. I really like digressive stuff, discursive prose. But I didn't even really notice it that much. Sometimes the parentheses get a little much, I would have to say. But it's hardly anything to worry about. I enjoyed it a lot. But by the end, all the threads tie up together. And the very end of A Heart So Wide is really excellent, really excellent. And the very end is where you start to see everything bleed together. And I think it has to be connected to the last chapter of Ulysses. I mean, the way it's like, maybe tributaries, small tributaries all flowing to a giant stream, and that metaphor I thought of to describe it makes me think of Finnegan's Wake as well. All of these different mythological tributaries all flowing together to create one, circular mythology that combines all of human thought, that sort of thing. Marías doesn't quite go that far. He kind of keeps it together, but his is mostly about the son is the father, and then in some ways the father is the son. The wives are the wives are connected. The sisters are connected through past and the present and the abstract future. At some point, what has happened in the past will happen in the future. But then you also have this sense of kind of almost too easy reconciliation too. And just in the back of my mind, I wonder how much that has to do with the dictatorship that was in Spain that ended in 1975. Because I was listening to this talk by Marías, and he was mentioning how with this Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, which I'm actually reading a history book of, I'll talk about that maybe in a different video, but he talks about the fact that the dictatorship, Franco's dictatorship, was horrible. And I don't think most people know that the dictatorship ended in 1975. I feel like most people feel like, oh, dictatorships, they only happen in the 40s and 50s, Stalin, whatever. And then they happen in Asia or Africa, whatever, but they don't happen in Europe that long. Or maybe Eastern Europe, but not Western Europe. But Spain did have a dictatorship until 75, and Marías talks about it, where women weren't even allowed to open up bank accounts without their consent of their husband or their father. Kind of crazy stuff like that. But he does mention that all the atrocities that the dictatorship did, and the people on that side were just kind of accepted whenever the dictatorship was over, so that they didn't have constant strife afterwards, is kind of how Marías describes it. And that's kind of what happens in A Heart So White, at least to the extent that we know what happened at the end, because it ends comparatively abruptly to the rest of the novel. But I don't know. The main thing I took away from the connection between the two is that it's almost that we have a choice what in our memory is fiction. And then, of course, the fiction can be the truth. And I think about our time, the last 100 years, where we have less and less fiction, I'd say, in the sense that a photograph really can't be fiction. A recording of someone's voice can't really be fiction. In the same way that, like, a history book from the 1700s is kind of fiction. It's kind of fiction because it's people matching up a bunch of memories together. Even if you do write something down, try to write it down verbatim. To an extent, it ends up being fiction. That's why I've never really bought the distinction between nonfiction and fiction, at least with writing. I think it's much hazier than people let on, especially younger people. It seems like they don't really seem to get it. But this idea that memory is fiction, but that doesn't imply that it's not true. I think there's this idea that is pretty defensible, and I'd like to make a video on it at some point, but that fiction is more true than reality. You know, that the real life, the real life, could be the fictional life. Not to draw it out too long, but it's just an interesting idea. I don't have any final conclusions, but I don't know. I'm definitely sympathetic to that type of thinking myself. But yeah, and then I'm excited to read more Marías. I've had him on my list for a while, and this is probably what I'm going to read next of his. Negra espalda del tiempo. The dark back of time. So when I get to it all, I'll let you know. All right, well, hopefully you enjoyed this kind of discursive, rambly video. Let me know what you guys think, if you guys have read either of those. Oh, and also I'm going to link the Spinecrackers podcast. They also read and talked about the real life of Sebastian Knight. I had meant to have a discussion with them, but some personal stuff came up and it wasn't possible. But hopefully we'll be able to have a discussion at some point. So anyway, go ahead and check them out. I'll link them in the description box. All right, well, death is a gang boss.